Hey everyone, so today I want to talk about figurative language and its limitations and sort of how we use it as a crutch sometimes to help express our points and what are the benefits perhaps still of figurative language, but also really how we can break the mold, break out of figurative language because it stymies oftentimes an original way of saying things. So it makes sense that we focus on figurative language, oftentimes metaphor, simile, that kind of thing, because that's really how we experience the world to begin, right? When we're even learning language, oftentimes we're mimicking somebody else. So it makes sense that we pick up their habits, we pick up the way they speak, pick up the phrases that they'll use to describe things. But as we know, that there's also this concept of cliche. So figurative language is used oftentimes because people are looking to connect to other people, and as humans we do want to connect and we do want to sort of mimic how other people talk because it creates better connections, right? There are studies that show that one way to make people like you is to mimic their habits, mimic their patterns of speech, and that includes the words that they're using, right? So part of that sort of focus on metaphor and simile is that we use it to connect other people. Similarly, also, there are many sort of ideas around how creating connections is what shows intelligence. So metaphor is connecting sort of one topic with another through an image, and simile even more so, right? This is like that. And so oftentimes we use it as sort of a way to show that we are intelligently thinking about things, right? I can connect this sort of disparate idea from one topic to another disparate idea in a different topic, and they're really not so different, and we're not so different, right? And we're creating all these connections through figurative language. However, what often comes up with the figurative language is that cliche, right? We fall into the patterns of other people, and oftentimes what a writer is supposed to do is not necessarily innovate on the world in the sense of creating a new product, but creating a new language, a new way to express them, an idea or something else that's happening in the world so that people see it in a certain way or experience it in a certain way. And so the limits of figurative language is that oftentimes it leads to cliche and falling into patterns and not challenging oneself to create better, more holistic approaches to language and specificity when they're writing. And really, I think the theme that's coming out through all these videos and through all these lessons is really that specificity is what creates spice, right? Is what creates interest, is what creates the writer themselves. Oftentimes, when you read something, you're like, oh, I know who wrote this based on the word choice. We know that with musicians, right? This lick sounds like this guitarist, or this drum fill feels like that drummer. And what that means is just really that they've created a pattern that feels like them, a technique that they do the best. And so language is another way to distinguish oneself in art. And as a writer, that should be the goal, right? To use language to distinguish voice through the words that are being used. And so what we want to do is sort of think about not only how we mimic things, but how we take those be aware of that mimicry and then turn it on its head and to think about it in a different way. So there are a lot of reasons, not only sort of to create interest and intrigue, but it also hones your own language, right? Language itself is a complicated thing because it means different things to different people. Tone is involved, sound is involved, word choice is involved. All these parts to language itself creates a message. And so when we think about literality versus figurative, what we're hoping to do is to hone our language oftentimes, because the honing of the language is really what allows for understanding. So in some ways, when I write, this is again a riff I think I've talked about in an earlier video, I'll link it above later, that literality is something that Plato wrestled with oftentimes, that language itself is a metaphor, right? It would be easier if we could, quote unquote, read each other's minds, or we could see exactly what somebody else means, right? That oftentimes when we say, here's a chair, the chair that one person has in their mind is different than the chair in another person's mind. And this difference imbues language with ambiguity. There's this book, 7 Types of Ambiguity. You might want to read it. It sort of goes through all these ideas about the hypothesis is there are only 7 types of ambiguity. You could argue one way or the other, but the point is that language itself is ambiguous because the person speaking it can't express fully what the words they're using mean all the time, right? It's just impractical. We can't spend 4 hours talking about what chair we're talking about, we would never get anything done. So we rely on these shortcuts to get our message across instead of really honing the language. But as a writer, you should be in love with the language, right? The language should be what's driving you. And so I think oftentimes focusing on the language allows to sidestep Plato's critique of language that ambiguity that's sort of built in. And when you see something in a specific way, it really, really draws the reader in because they might realize something they hadn't before, right? This chair specifically serves this purpose because it's described this way. And all of a sudden you see this item that you sort of pass over on a daily basis, right? The chair, and you see it in a whole new way. And that sort of opens the world for you in a new way. That creates a new experience for the reader. And it comes back to the idea of connections, right? We were talking before about sort of the limitations of figurative language being that we use it to create connections, but they sort of keep connections also at bay because we are not using our own language. And so you hide yourself through your language, right? And so by creating more distinct literal language, you're actually allowing more of yourself to be out there, to connect to other people. And really that's the point, right? The sort of thing that we're accomplishing through art, through writing, is connections with others, right? Connections with self also, right? Connections in general is sort of the focus, right? Connecting those different things together that we experience, right? Somebody who is well experienced in music and tries to take that into their writing versus somebody who's well experienced in computer technology and tries to take that to their writing will have two different ways of explaining and exploring an item. And that really, really creates different connections throughout a person's mind and in their experience, their feelings, their emotions, their response to the writing. And so when you think of how to get to literal language, the way to do that might be to really, really sit down and think about what is happening in front of you or what experience you're trying to accomplish. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in another video, a further explanation of form, meaning, function. But here, for a brief sort of exploration, form, meaning, function is just when you're experiencing, for example, sand, what is the feel of sand, right? Sand is a tangible physical object, and so you want to think about feeling and how you describe the feelings of sand. And so oftentimes people just say, it feels like a Brillo pad or something coarse, right? And to a degree, they're not wrong, right? Sand is coarse, but wet sand is one thing, dry sand is another thing. Sand with trash mixed in, unfortunately, because of the way things go, right, is a different thing. Sand with that is made from different materials is different, right? There are different types of sands, different types of beaches. We know that there are rocky beaches where sand and rocks are more mixed in together. There's sand on beautiful beaches where it's just straight sand and it's always in the sun and it's just fine grained, and right? And so when you say sand, it's not so clear to the reader, and so you want to focus on what type of sand and to think of perhaps bringing in cross genres or cross topics, right? We're talking about connections. So if you can make connections, it connects to other people and their worlds. So sand as a scientific fact is different than sand as an artistic endeavor. And what I mean by that is, right, a scientist who studies how sand is formed, how sand feels, etc., will have different words. And so you might want to study topics, right? It's always good to learn new things. And as a writer, you should be interested in things in general, observational at the very least. And so using other categories, other topics of study in order to help explain what the thing you're describing is can be very, very helpful when you're thinking about literal language. So the quick prompt today, after the exploration of why literal language might be a good exercise to undertake, is to think about how to take a literal experience and translate it to the reader. So what that means is, again, we can use senses and experience here. And so the prompt might be, how does sand feel on the beach, right? That might be the poem. Or the story might be, how does sand feel when it's thrown at you by a partner, right? You're trying to take a literal experience and explain it literally to the reader. And hopefully that sparks new language and new ways of looking at a sort of trite item in your life, quote unquote trite, right? Everything can sort of be explored, so hopefully not trite anymore, right? It will hopefully spark reinvigoration into something that seems mundane in your life. And I'm hoping that you guys share those with us down below or at the journal. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please rate, share, and subscribe. And of course, we also have a Patreon. Feel free to go over there and check it out if you like what we're doing and want to help support the channel. And I'll see you in the next one.